Hello, everyone. Hey, it's great to see you. Welcome to week 2 of Crazy Love at Westside's Alaska campus. We're so glad to have you come north with us. These temperatures are brutal, aren't they? Man, I'm proud of you guys. We got a great crowd here. It was fun to see lots of folk out in the concourse. Welcome to Westside. Welcome to those of you who are worshiping with us online. We're really glad that you're here as well. Now, if you're at the start of a promising relationship, if you're recently engaged, recently married, you may have seen us promote the Crazy Love series and thought, this is going to be incredible. Instead of 4 weeks, this series should be 40 weeks long. We should dedicate the rest of 2021 to celebrating love. But if you're coming out of a disappointing relationship, or you feel stuck in a stagnant one, or you recently lost a spouse, or you've decided your dating days are over, or you've looked for love and haven't found it, a series like this could be awkward, even painful. It's Valentine's Day, and not everyone celebrates Valentine's Day the way people who are madly in love do. And if you've had to will yourself to be with us for this series, I just want you to know how proud I am of you for doing it. I admire you for doing it. Someone messaged me earlier and said, I found it hard to want to worship online today, but I'm so glad I did, and I hope others will walk through that same journey this morning. Now, if you dated and married before the dating apps for smartphones became a thing, you did not have that advantage in finding and building a relationship. You also didn't have that frustration, because those who use dating apps seem to be almost universally critical of them, though online dating continues to be a multi-billion-dollar business. The most common criticism is that dating apps reduce people to a photograph and a few words, which just encourages people to be even more shallow, more superficial than we already are. One young woman decided to test her theory about online dating by using a friend's photograph. Her friend happened to be a model. In her profile, she made an effort to describe herself as the worst person on earth. She claimed qualities like kicks homeless people's cups out of their hands. She said, my parents think I'm in law school, so they pay my bills, LOL. Message me if you're rich. But because her friend's photo was so striking, she received 150 messages from interested men the first day her profile was up, 1,000 the first week. I read about a guy named Aaron who decided he really couldn't compete on the popular dating apps because his photo wasn't that impressive. He wasn't sure that he would be noticed. So he worked with a friend who was a software developer to launch his own app called Singularity. The tagline was, "Online dating simplified." Well, it was simplified because Aaron was the only available man on the entire app. And when women opened the app to look for dates, the first photo they would see would be Aaron's photo. But when they tried to view other men, they would find more photographs of Aaron in different clothing, taken in different locations. The entire project was a joke, but Aaron later said that he wanted to highlight the difficulty of dating in the digital era. But if you think finding love was easier back in the day, that's not true. It has always been a challenge. Lewis and Clark are famous for exploring our continent after the Louisiana Purchase, when the country was largely unmapped. After successfully crossing the continent to the West Coast and returning home, Lewis and Clark were probably the two most famous men in America. But Meriwether Lewis still had trouble finding women to court. Ironically, he found it easier to navigate an unknown continent than to navigate romantic relationships. A big part of this series is offering hope and guidance to people who are already in relationships. But today, I want to highlight some important perspectives and some convictions for those of us who are not crazy in love at the moment, but who may want to find love in the future, or who may not be interested in finding love in the future. Steve Callahan designed and built a boat that he sailed around the world. But after his vessel collided with what was likely a whale, he found himself in serious trouble. Callahan abandoned his boat as it sank, and he spent 76 days adrift in a 6-foot inflatable raft. It took all of his survival training, all his supplies and resourcefulness to remain hopeful and to remain alive. He lost a third of his body weight before he was eventually seen and rescued. And though he couldn't control the raft, Callahan actually attached 2 pencils, and he created a very crude sextant, which is a navigational tool that measures the angular distance between the horizon and fixed celestial objects like planets and stars. It was the closest thing ancient sailors had to a GPS. So Callahan literally kept his bearings while adrift for 2.5 months in the Atlantic by relying on the unchanging truth of the universe that was written across the sky. And that is a very good way for us to think as we navigate the choppy, dangerous waters of romantic relationships. We all realize that we live in a time where the cautious, measured model of building relationships has taken on water and it's sunk to the ocean floor. The old rules are being ignored and they're being mocked by some people. And that leaves us with the feeling that we have no choice but to let the current of what modern relationships are just take us where it will. But listen, we can all decide whether or not we'll be lost in the sea of relationships. We can choose to drift from relationship to relationship, and we can hope that relationship magic is going to happen for us at some point, or we can fix our eyes on some unchanging truths of the universe, which for us actually begins with a person, ironically, since we're talking about relationships. Hebrews 13:8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The times, they are a-changin', as the old folks say. It's true. And the pace of change is just accelerating. So in some ways, you and I simply have to face that truth and we have to try to hold on. But in other ways, trying to keep up with our culture is a trap. Just like a wise sailor can look to the heavens and know that the planets and the stars are reliable visual reference points, we can look to Jesus. We can look to God's word to know how to evaluate relationships and how to build relationships. The Apostle John wrote one of our 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. But John also wrote 3 letters that appear near the end of our New Testament. We call them very creatively 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Now take a look at 1 John chapter 4, verse 7. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Now notice what John is doing here. He doesn't say, hey, let's love one another because if we do, when we do, good things are going to happen down the line. Good things are going to result downstream. John could have written that, and in other places the Bible makes that claim and expresses that truth. Love produces good fruit. But in this verse, John does not point downstream to what results when we love. Instead, John points us, he directs our attention upstream to the original source of love. And he wants to remind us that love doesn't actually begin with us. If you find it challenging to love people, if you wonder why you even have the urge, the impulse to love, this verse explains it. Because love comes from God. Last week, I gave you a phrase to remember that I think is worth repeating today. God is love, and love is God's. And if you just allow your philosophy, your understanding of love to be saturated with that truth, it is going to serve you well. We reviewed the very first relationship in the Bible last week, Adam and Eve, and I reminded us that romance and love and attraction and sex have all been gifted to us by our Creator. It all comes from the mind of God, from the heart of God. So it makes sense to rediscover what God intended for all of those things. And this is one of those basic truths of the universe that we can use to measure our lives and to measure our relationships. It is one of the fixed realities by which we can navigate the choppy seas of relationships. Although many people don't think of relationships as a spiritual challenge, the realm of love and relationships absolutely is spiritual. It belongs to God. And John is affirming this in the passage that we're looking at. In fact, a couple of paragraphs further into 1 John chapter 4, John writes, "We love each other because he first loved us." Again, he's looking upstream. He's showing us that this capacity we have to love, it comes from God. Now, it's no surprise that we love God because God first loved us. And most of us would guess that was the sequence of events. God loved us, we love him back. But notice, if God had not loved us first, then we would not love each other. We wouldn't know what it means to love another human being. God is the pioneer when it comes to loving people. He's the originator of love. You are wise if you look to God for guidance on love. I've mentioned before, several years ago, that I was a lifeguard during high school, between years of high school. And I think I told you a number of years ago that I took the life-saving course and training from a guy named Willard. Willard was a few years older than me, and he drove a convertible red MG, and that made him very cool in my eyes. But Willard genuinely cared about those of us who took life-saving from him. So he did not make it easy for us because he cared about us. He made us work to pass our final exam, and the final exam was pulling Willard from the deep end of the swimming pool. He was pretending to be a swimmer in distress. And to make it even tougher, Willard covered himself with baby oil. And he fought us as we tried to save him, because that's what happens when people are actually drowning. And Willard drilled into us that when people are frightened, when people are desperate for air, for oxygen, they will grab anything or anyone within reach, and they will attempt to use it for a flotation device. So even though the victim does not intend to harm you, in that person's desperation, he or she can hurt you, can kill you. And that's why so many people who jump into deep water to save someone end up drowning with that person. They're not prepared for what a distressed swimmer can do when he or she panics. Now stay with me, because I think I'm going to pull these things together. When people don't realize that love actually originates with God, and that they are loved by God, that their identity is a person who is loved by God, what does a person like that do? That person seeks all the love they need from the people in their lives or from one special person in that person's life. And when that happens, both people can suffocate. We were not created to receive all the love we need from one person or even from all the people in our lives. We were created to be loved first and best by God. God's love is the foundational love for all of us. God's love meets our basic need to be loved. And even if we are never loved by another human being, even though that presents a deficit in our lives, we are still loved enough because we are loved by God. Sometimes we place unreasonable expectations on the people who love us because we haven't acknowledged or accepted the love of God, and we look for so much love from that person, an amount of love, a kind of love that another human being can't give. But you don't do that if you know you're loved by God, because there is a deep need that is already filled, and everything else is bonus. When we know we're loved, when we know we're valued by God, if we happen to enjoy a season of being loved by a spouse or by someone else, it really is an extra blessing. Now, it's an added responsibility too, but it's an added blessing. And if it's really good, if it's healthy, it can be a reflection of God's love. We can acknowledge that it's a gift from God, but it will never replace the love of God. Human love will never make God's love obsolete for you or for me. Another way to say that is that God's love is essential. Romantic love, human love, is optional. But our world has gotten that totally backwards, upside down even. The world tries to convince us that God's love is optional. Well, if you want to do the God thing, that's fine, but it's really not that important. It's kind of obsolete in the age of science, some people would say. But sex and romance, those things are essential to a happy life. You've got to find that if you want to be happy. Friend, there are a lot of satisfied single people who roll their eyes when married people begin to pity them. And look, even though a widow or a widower nearly always misses the spouse who has died, the vast majority of widows and widowers continue to live with joy and meaning after the death of a spouse. Now, it is a different kind of life, but it can still be a very good life. My father died in 1990. He's been gone for over 30 years. But even though my mom misses him, she is living a joyful life because she knows she is loved by God. She knows that she's loved by other people. The same is true for my wife's mother. And I see the same thing with widows and widowers in our church. Some of them had absolutely wonderful spouses, but even though they miss them terribly, life is still good because the love of God sustains them and remains with them. Psalm 136 is a different kind of chapter in our Bibles. It's even a different kind of psalm because over and over again in that psalm, it repeats a phrase, and you can say it out loud with me. His love endures forever. Let's say it again. His love endures forever. You said it a lot fewer times than it's actually printed in that psalm. Before I'm married, God's love endures forever. While I am married, if I marry, God's love endures forever. After my spouse passes, God's love endures forever. The love of God was with me decades of my life before I met Sharon. It will be with me if she leaves this world before I do. The most enduring, the most important love in my life and your life is the love of God. Romans 8, verse 38 says, I am convinced that nothing can ever separate us from God's love. Neither death nor life, angels or demons, fears for today or worries about tomorrow, not even the powers of hell can separate us from God's love. No power in the sky above or in the earth below. Indeed, nothing in all creation will ever be able to separate us from the love of God that is revealed in Christ Jesus our Lord. That is the love you need most. It's the love I need most. It's the love that you and I can't live without. And when people don't have that, when they don't know it's available, when they don't understand it, people sometimes try to draw or extract all the love they need from another person. And they cling to another person in a way that is actually not what God intended. I think Jesus met someone who was confused about where she could find the love that she needed to fill her life. We call her the Samaritan woman or the woman at the well. And her story is recorded in John chapter 4. When she came to the well that day, Jesus was there and he asked her for a drink of water. And that started the conversation about water that doesn't satisfy for very long and the water that Jesus said that he could give, which actually satisfies forever. And when he told her that he could give her that kind of water, a kind of water that would allow her to never thirst again, she basically sneered at him and said, I doubt it. But then Jesus revealed something that he knew about her. She'd been married 5 times. She was living with a man to whom she wasn't married. And that sounds like the kind of thing that a preacher like Jesus might say to shame a woman, but Jesus actually wasn't trying to shame her. He was simply proving to her that he knew she was looking for a love that would fulfill her and that she had never found it. Now, maybe there were financial factors and there were certainly cultural factors in those marriages. It was very difficult for a woman who had been married, was no longer married, and there were laws and rules and guidelines that all could have contributed to the number of marriages, but Jesus knew that she was searching for a love she had not been able to find. And I think Jesus would say the same thing to people who have taken a lot of shots at relationships in their lives. And when some of us hear that phrase, we know it applies to us. And I think Jesus would say to you something like what he said to that woman. He would say, I see you. I know you better than you realize. I know you better than you know yourself. And I know that you've never experienced a love that was so full and so permanent that it satisfied you at the deepest level forever. You thought romance would do it, but it didn't, so you became cynical about romance. You thought sex would do it, but it didn't, and you became cynical about sex. And I think Jesus would go on to say, the love I give is unselfish concern. It's total acceptance, and it will not fade over time. I'm the love you're looking for. That's what Jesus wants you to hear him saying. He's the love you're looking for. I think God wants to speak into the restless, relational person in the room or online today. This may be your moment at the well with Jesus. He knows your unedited story, and he loves you. And he always has. And he always will. And he wants his love, his presence, to be the fountain that just continually fills you with living water so that you never thirst in the way you once did ever again. And if you think I'm only speaking to those who are currently single today, I'm not. The truth is that we are all destined by God to spend a lot of our years as single people. Have you thought about that? Was anyone here born married? Some of you have been married so long you think you were born married. But you actually weren't born married, were you? You married young, but not that young. By the way, at any given moment, 45% of American adults are unmarried. They're either single prior to marriage, divorced, widowed, or have been always unmarried. So it's just silly for us to view singleness as something that is so strange when nearly half of the adult population is single. I spent 24 years and 11 months of my life single before I was married. And that part of my life was God's will for me for that season. And since it's unlikely that my wife and I will die at the same time, though she has thought we might, sometimes when I've been driving, one of us has some single years coming in all likelihood. And if we follow the statistics, it'll be her. And just as our married years are God's will for us, the widow or widower years will be God's will for us as single people. Sometimes we are so close-minded about singleness that we forget Jesus was single. The great apostle Paul was single. In fact, he wrote this in 1 Corinthians 7, I wish everyone were single just as I am. Yet each person has a special gift from God of one kind or another. Do you hear what he's saying? Paul did not view singleness as evidence that God had decided not to bless you or that God took a blessing away from you. Paul viewed singleness as just as much a gift as marriage, but a different kind of gift. And Paul could see how the gift of singleness was just right for him because it allowed him to prioritize his relationship with God and his work for God, his ministry. I mean, some single people view the gift of singleness like the gift of socks and underwear at Christmas. Gee, thanks a lot, Mom. Paul said, oh no, it is much better than that. There is much more blessing in it than that. God can do a lot with your singleness if you let him. Hey, look, there are some parts of my life that I would not want you to emulate. but I did a couple of things during my single young adult years that I recommend for anyone who is single today. First, pray about the future and refuse to resent the present. Don't despise your current circumstances. While I was single in my 20s, I poured my whole life into the church, almost literally. And my son did the same thing during his single adult years in his early 20s. He worked for a church 70 plus hours a week and loved it. He has a family now, and he shouldn't do that, but when you're single, that's a great way to live. So look, if you're single, can I just encourage you to get serious about following Jesus, to get serious about being a part of his church? Maybe you'll marry someday, maybe you won't. Either way, entrust your circumstances to God and stop obsessing over a blessing that God hasn't given you at this time. Accept the blessing that he has given you. By the way, if you're single, I want you to look around carefully and notice the really tired people. Because they are married. And they probably have kids, right? Now look, there is purpose and blessing in that phase of life and those circumstances, and that is God's will for a lot of people. But look, marriage is not all Instagram moments. Don't idealize it. Paul said, if I was married, I'd be distracted from some of the work that I'm able to do for God. I see the upside of being single. If you're single, have you ever thought about the fact that God wants you single at this time in your life so that you can be more about him, more about his kingdom, more about his mission? Don't overlook the blessing of your situation, even if it's not the blessing that you expected or even the one that you prefer. And if the grass looks greener for all the folks on the other side of that fence, don't forget that the lawn requires more work. It's a blessing to be married. It's a blessing to have a family. It is also a blessing to be single. And look, married people get that through our heads, will we? They're just different kinds of blessings. Find the blessing in your situation and use it all you can for God's glory. Because if you do, no part, no season in your life will be wasted. It will all be devoted to God. To be honest with you, when I began writing this message, I did not realize I was going to spend so much time speaking to and about single people. But I want to close today with some takeaways that are not only for singles, but I want to speak to singles as I say these things. First of all, if you're single, instead of scrolling through other people's lives, live your own life. Now, frankly, that is good advice for those of us who are married too, right? Because sometimes we are better at viewing other people's lives than we are actually engaging in our own. And we make way too much time for social media when about 10% of it is worthwhile. But if you're single, it might be even more tempting for you to live vicariously through your screen. And hey, for the last 11 months, we've all been discouraged from getting together, doing life with other people, and that's made us even more dependent on our screens. We have got to prepare to break out of that. As the COVID cloud lifts, use the opportunity to restructure your life. Get in front of people. Go to breakfast and dinner with people. Join a group, lead a group, volunteer. If the day or the time comes when you can't get out as much, when you have to stay home more, accept it graciously. But until then, put down the screen and find your people. Secondly, if you're single, I just want you to know and remember a truth, that some married people are lonely too. And if you think marriage is a 100% in every case cure for loneliness, you're not looking very closely. If you're single, I want you to be wise. I want you to truly believe that it is better for you to remain single than it is for you to marry unwisely. To paraphrase Tommy Nelson, who's taught a lot on relationships, you can go to sleep and wake up next to someone with whom you really don't have a connection, and you can still feel lonely. And frankly, that kind of loneliness is worse than the loneliness of being single, believe it or not. Those of you who've been around Westside for a few years or more, you know Gary Winkleman, who served on our staff for decades. I mean, we sent him out west with Lewis and Clark one time, and he came back just like they did. And Gary was a pastor to single adults here in our church for a long time. And in his final years, he led our pastoral care to hospitals. And he was married for a number of years. Everybody loves Gary. So many people have a story about how Gary has blessed them, ministered to them. Gary's wife of many years passed away a couple of years ago, but he recently remarried to a woman who's part of our church who also lost her husband a number of years ago. I had the privilege of officiating their wedding, and I was especially moved by an object that they used in their wedding that they asked me to explain to those who attended. Have you heard of a cairn? A cairn is a series of stones stacked atop one another, which is used to represent a significant moment or a significant commitment. And the entire concept is based on God's command to the Israelites to construct a stone monument after they crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And in Gary and Susan's case, their cairn included, I think, 6 stones. The bottom stone is the foundation, and they named that stone Faith. And it represents their common belief that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that they want to build their relationship, their home, their marriage on his teachings. And then there are stones that represent hope and service to others and laughter, which I love that they included. There's a stone that represents their deceased spouses, because so much of who Gary and Susan are today is a result of those marriages. And it was beautiful for them to acknowledge that reality. And it's a reminder that relationships during various chapters of our lives do not have to compete with one another. And the top stone is love, because that's what keeps a relationship vibrant and alive, healthy. But the coolest part of all of this is that Gary and Susan are going to place the cairn, those stones and what they represent, inside the entrance to their home, so that everyone who enters, and so that they, when they pass it, will be reminded of what they are building their home and their marriage upon, who they're building their lives upon. Listen, I've seen some healthy marriages where the husband and the wife do not share faith in Jesus. And because they are respectful of one another, because they are unselfish, because they're uncontrolling, they make it work. But single friend, my best advice to you is to choose to accept the gift of singleness until or unless you can build a marriage and a home on the bedrock of faith in Jesus Christ. Even then, it will be challenging at times. But you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you.